Hello, I am Kamal Kishore. I am based in New Delhi, India. I work for the National Disaster Management Authority of India. I have many years of experience working on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues. My first experience working in this area was after 1991 earthquake in Uttarkashi. After that, I worked in India in two post-disaster situations, and then internationally after more than 10 different disaster events, where I've helped through the United Nations countries develop the strategies for post-disaster relief, response, recovery, and reconstruction. I have been in the post-tsunami operations Maldives to Sri Lanka after the earthquake last year in Nepal, 2005 earthquake in Pakistan. I've been in Iran after 2003 earthquake, Philippines after the 2013 cyclone Haiyan. So I have done this for a long time. I'll be happy to take questions not on the topic generally, but also specifically for any of the geographies I've worked in. Now, this is a very important area of work. In a very short time, basically, we cover three aspects of post-disaster response. We look at post-disaster immediate relief and rescue, which is primarily focused on issues related to saving lives and stabilizing the humanitarian situation after a big disaster. And the second part we talk about is the long-term reconstruction and recovery, where we build back what was lost, not just in the physical sense, but also in a societal sense. And we aim to build back better. And the third aspect we talk about is something which you can call a transition between relief and reconstruction. By that, I don't mean that there are three distinct phases, but the whole notion of early recovery, providing long-term recovery support early on, so that people can quickly get onto their feet and begin to recover. All of these three phases have enormous challenges. Let's talk a little bit about the challenge we have in immediate relief. I think immediate relief, the biggest challenge, of course, is the timeliness. For example, after earthquakes, the search and rescue operations have to be done very quickly. If a very sophisticated search and rescue team arrives 3 days later, it's of very little use. The support that we provide has to be relevant. You have to the food that you offer, the clothing you offer, provide to the affected people have to be suitable for their needs. Likewise, how do we dynamically assess the needs and modulate the relief to actually meet the needs of the affected people, the real needs, and not provide things which are not relevant. There have been instances where in the relief operation we have a situation where medicines are sent, but labeling is in the wrong language, it's not understood by anyone. So that is an example of a relief item not being relevant. Similarly, there is a big challenge that relief operation should not create a dependency. It is very easy to undermine the local initiative, the local resources, local strengths, and supplant that with the outside input, which may provide relief quickly, but it can also lead to dependency over the long term. So there are challenges there in relief and response, immediate response after a disaster. Long-term reconstruction requires a very different order of magnitude of resources. For example, if those of you who've followed the post-earthquake recovery work in Nepal, the reconstruction needs there were in the excess of $5 billion. It's very, very big. It requires work across multiple sectors, from housing, health, education, transport, communication, And all of this has to come together to give a good recovery outcome for the people so that their lives are safer, better, more prosperous than it was there, more resilient than it was before the event. And then the third aspect is really early recovery. There was a time when we used to really talk about these different aspects in a very sort of strict compartmentalized sense, that we will first do relief and then we will do reconstruction. And very quickly it was realized that you cannot have that kind of artificial phasing. All of these things with different emphasis happen at the same time. There was the earthquake in 2003 in Iran, and I was there 3 days after the earthquake, and I saw a family which had lost some of his family members. Just 3 days after the earthquake, they were already rebuilding. So they are not waiting for the relief phase to be over to start rebuilding. So we need to provide support to that there and then. So it is important to provide some kind of support, recovery support early on, so that there is a strong foundation for sustainable recovery. There is a strong foundation for building back better. There is another example from Myanmar. If you Myanmar cyclone happened in 2008 in the month of May. This was a planting season. So each week's delay in providing the farmers inputs for their agricultural operations, for the planting, for seeds and fertilizers and agricultural implement. Each week's delay in providing that means that further down you will need another 3 months of food assistance. So it is important that that support is provided early on as well. So a lot of work has happened on the notion of early recovery, and codification of this practice has happened over the last 15 years, and we have come a long way. So these are the three things. Some of you may have seen the MOOC where I talk a little bit more in detail about this. So with this preface, now I'm happy to take questions from you. Is my understanding correct that there is a question on what are the lessons from Gujarat post-earthquake operations that the 2001 earthquake, I guess we are referring to, that can be applied to other states? Is that the question? Okay, I think that's a very good question. What I would like to highlight is there are many lessons from post-earthquake recovery in Gujarat, and I would say that it is not possible to cover everything. Gujarat earthquake was one of the most successful post-earthquake recovery programs in India. So there are many lessons that can be drawn, but I would like to highlight three. The first lesson from Gujarat was that it is very important to build partnerships for recovery. It is not possible for the government or any single entity to deliver all the reconstruction, all the recovery support by itself. So Gujarat did a very good job of building partnership across civil society organization, private sector, academic institutions, and of course the state and the local government. So taking a partnership approach where everyone has lesson that we learned from Gujarat. In the initial days of Gujarat earthquake recovery, perhaps that was not being pursued and it was very sort of government-centric thing. But over a period of time, very quickly, it became a sort of multi-stakeholder approach with a number of people supporting. The second lesson was that we must never look at the affected people as subjects of our intervention. They are the principal actors in recovery, and whatever we do must capitalize on their strengths, their initiatives, and their resources. So, Gujarat, on a very large scale, uh, started the process of owner driven reconstruction, where actually the decision making about the housing recovery was done by owners themselves. And government's job was to provide material, money, building materials, money, technical expertise, and technical oversight and guidance to make sure that the money was being used to build back better and we were not rebuilding the same vulnerabilities. That's the second thing. The third is that the third lesson from Gujarat is that it provided a very good opportunity to build back better, not just in a physical sense, but also in the sense of a system. And Gujarat came up with one of the first state level disaster management laws. To some extent, the national law, which came later, draws upon that and builds on that experience. So it is an opportunity to create a disaster risk reduction system as well. So I think these are the three big lessons takeaway for me. Uh, Takeaway from me, uh, which I would like to highlight. Now, the second question from Nilanjana is what kind of urban policy and institutional environment will support early reconstruction? Here, I think there are two things. One is that we have to have a mechanism. I presume you're talking about early recovery and not so much about early reconstruction. I will address the issue of reconstruction in a short while, but let's talk about early recovery. The first thing is that it is very important to very quickly assess what is it that people want, what is the kind of support that will help people recover very quickly. I'll give you an example. When we were doing an assessment of early recovery needs in Pakistan after the 2005 earthquake, a large number of people, they didn't want any material support immediately, but they wanted the banking facilities to resume so that they could have access to their own finances immediately. They wanted the government to buy their own livestock and give them a certificate, some sort of a check, if you like, in lieu of that, and return the cattle to them 6 months later when they had the capability to actually maintain and provide for the cattle. So that those are the kinds of things which determine what is it that the people want, which people think will help them recover quickly. So I think that is an outreach to the people, a vision of recovery which is determined by the affected people themselves is something which is very, very important. Now, talking about early reconstruction. On early reconstruction, the thing is that we can talk about early reconstruction, and this is a big challenge after any disaster. There is this tyranny of rush. On one hand, we want to build back better. On the other hand, there is tremendous pressure, including political pressure, to reconstruct quickly. We sometimes make unrealistic promises that we will have the houses built in the next 6 months or a year and a half or by such and such festival. But in reality, it takes, especially if you want to build back better, a lot of preparatory work has to be done. You need to have good hazard vulnerability risk assessments to inform that. So there has to be a balance between swift recovery, because reconstruction has to be swift. It can't take forever, and good reconstruction. So it is every reconstruction program presents this unique opportunity of these twin challenges, and we have to balance one against the others. What will assist that process is a preparedness to launch recovery programs or reconstruction and recovery programs before a disaster. There is a lot of emphasis on putting in place advance arrangements for immediate response. But each time there is, every time there is a big disaster, countries often struggle to, to define what will be the institutional arrangement for managing such a large reconstruction program. Are we going to have a separate authority? Are we going to have a special purpose vehicle? Will a particular department of existing line department of the government will take the lead? Are we going to take a multi-sectorial committee approach to it? How will we do it? So that discussion on what is the kind of mechanism that will drive reconstruction, that is something we should think about even before a disaster, and not wait for a disaster to experiment with different models. There are examples where 6 months are taken before a clarity emerges on how a reconstruction will be managed. I think those questions are questions which we need to answer before a disaster occurs, and have institutional arrangements designed before an event occurs. With after Nilanjana's question, we have another one from uh, Pia, which says, "What kind of challenges have you met when working on strategies to build back better in existing local urban plans?" I think to some extent I answered this question in response to Nilanjana's question, but I can add some more things to that. I think one big challenge in building back better is that, uh, of course, we need good scientific risk information quickly available. Then the second is, how do we ensure that the supply chains for building materials are established very quickly, and we have the amount of building materials that is quickly required available in a very short time. And thirdly, how do we generate the kind of trained manpower that you need to build back better in a very short time? Let me illustrate that with an example from an ongoing reconstruction program in Nepal, where we have nearly 500,000 houses to be built. Now, to build so many houses, you need at least 100,000 masons, ready immediately, who have been trained in not just simple masonry work, but also earthquake-resistant masonry work. So how do you sort of scale up very quickly? So I think that's one big challenge. So these three principal challenges in building back better, in addition to what I said in response to Nilanjana, uh, risk information, which is scientific, usable, practical, setting up supply chains for building materials, and finally, the human resource capacity. Now we go to the next question, which is from Ria Bordeloy, which is, how does approaches to reconstruction differ between rural and urban areas? I think that's an excellent question. I think first, there are many ways in which these differ. First issue is that the whole issue of land management. How do we, like, a lot of the times after a disaster, there is an increasing demand for resettlement because it is perceived that area where the disaster occurred, a major disaster occurred, is not safe. So resettlement issues, there is a little more flexibility when it comes to resettlement in rural areas compared to urban areas. But this is not to say that I am recommending that resettlement is always the best option. I think that resettlement is a complex issue, and disaster risk is only one parameter which determines whether it's a good idea or not. So that's one thing. The second thing is that in rural and urban areas, community structures, community cohesion, local governance systems are very different. You know, sometimes for some kinds of reconstruction in rural areas, it's easier to organize communities than in a very heterogeneous urban community. So I think that's the second thing. The third is that in some urban locations, you may find that the affected people have access to finance and they may have some of them may have insurance covers and so on. So I think that sort of brings in greater initiative or greater capacity from the urban dwellers in coming back up on their feet. Of course, there are also inequities in urban areas which also come into play. There are challenges if you have in an urban area, if you have a household which has lost a house, but it was on sort of it was a squatter settlement. They didn't have land tenure. What are we going to do for them? Are they going to now get a land tenure, a secure title to the house that gets built? What is the proportion in which we provide assistance? So I think these things become a lot more complex in urban areas. The urban design element of reconstruction also is much more complex because you're working in limited space. A lot of dense urban areas require some sort of, one would call it, conservative surgery, so that you decongest the area and make it more resilient as the urban fabric. So that's a big challenge we have to face. And I think the in Bhuj that was done, it was used in, the reconstruction was used as an opportunity to actually reimagine the urban landscape and make it more resilient. So I think that I'm trying to answer the question that Ria has posed in a very brief way, but of course both rural and urban areas have their own unique challenges that we can look more deeply into. Then the next question is Hugo's question: how does government should asset to engage citizens to cooperate with disaster recovery? How does government engage citizens for a recovery? Look, there are many ways in which government can engage citizens for recovery. I would highlight two main ways. One is where the recovery is of private assets, private buildings. The government should really not try to control it too much and set standards and trust the citizens to actually lead recovery and actually be the drivers of recovery. I think the approach that I talked about in the context of Gujarat, the owner-driven reconstruction, has shown us that. Of course, this is not to say that owner-driven reconstruction works in every situation, but in many situations it works. Where it works, we should really put the leadership, put the onus on citizens and be facilitators of recovery rather than providers of recovery. The second thing that government can do is set up a very good information and communication system by which the government is continuously listening from the citizens and at the same time communicating with them. Let me give you an example. After the Iran earthquake in 2003, we started a small initiative in the earthquake affected area called BAM, and we identified 50 women in the affected community who were literate and who could, uh, with a little bit of training, produce a newsletter every 15 days. So every 15 days, they produced a newsletter which was called The Balm We Want. And that newsletter, half of that newsletter would talk about what people's entitlements are from the government. If they have lost a certain asset, what is the assistance government is providing? What is the procedure for accessing that? And half of it was, what is it that people's concerns are? If there are adolescent kids who have lost their uh, basketball field or volleyball field to relief camps, it's a problem for them. They don't have a place to play. So they should have an outlet to air these concerns. So what I'm trying to say is that with citizens, if the government can come up with an information and communication system, which is a two-way system, a systematic, regular, and continuous, I think that is a very effective way of engaging with the citizens in recovery. After Hugo, we have Zafia's question, which says, can big infrastructure itself be a risk? in the context of dams, should there be fewer dams? I think that's again a very good question. In a typical disaster, let's say an earthquake, uh, you can say that up to 60% of the losses, or 50 to 60% of the losses, are private losses. You can't really term them as private sector losses, but these are private losses because housing constitutes a big chunk of that. And the remaining 50%, 40 to 50%, is public sector losses. And within public sector losses, two-thirds of the losses oftentimes are infrastructure losses. And the issue with that is that, of course, there is infrastructure loss, and recovery, reconstruction of that infrastructure loss causes fiscal stress to the governments. But it also leads to productivity losses. If you don't have a road, if you don't have a bridge, it affects recovery of livelihoods for the people who live there. So yes, I think the point you're saying is that infrastructure itself can be a risk. It can be at risk, and it can itself uh, be a risk. But there are ways to make them disaster resistant in the first place. And when I say disaster resistant, we have to talk about not just the making the infrastructure itself, the physical facility itself, resilient, but also make sure that it does not create downstream risks. For example, you may have a metro line which is running on an elevated system. That itself may be very resilient to flood uh, and cyclones, for example, but it may have disrupted the drainage in the city. So it has become a risk. It has created a downstream risk. So a holistic understanding of risk, which doesn't look at risk only the physical risk to the infrastructure, but also the downstream risk it creates, is very essential. Next question is by Richard, which says, how do you see communities developing and leveraging social networks to support disaster preparedness and recovery? I think to some extent I have answered the question in response to uh, Hugo, but I just want to make one point here, that uh, the uh, the facility that now the new systems provide, especially social media, with a little bit of facilitation, the coordination after disaster can be not just like vertical between the state and the citizens, but also there can be a lot of horizontal coordination where citizens groups come together. There is a standard, say, hashtag policy where after a disaster you design a hashtag in certain way and connect people horizontally, and people become both providers and receivers of help. And this particularly in urban contexts where mobile phone penetration is very high, smartphone penetration is very high. This has happened in many cases. Like 2015 floods in Chennai is an example of that. Next question we have is from Preeti Bhandari. Where our infrastructure are already overburdened, wouldn't we need to limit growth of cities as a policy? Uh, I think it's a very large question. It's a big question, and in some cases, I that is what we may have to do. That we don't look at. We basically have to recognize that the city, in certain ways, has reached its carrying capacity, and the city's carrying capacity has a close linkage with the kind of risk it has and how that risk can be managed. In such a situation, we have to look at the city not just in isolation, but take a more regional planning approach and see what is the regional picture of risk, and how are we managing that risk. So I think yes, in some cases, limiting or managing growth of a city has to be one of the policy alternatives for managing disaster risk. The next question we have is from Mokshika. In your opinion, who do we focus more on in India? Preparedness, response, or recovery? I would say that at the moment there is uh, much greater focus on preparedness than on response. Just to give you an example, just as we speak, there are 9 states which are experiencing floods. In those 9 states, 38 districts are uh, suffering from floods. And in each one of these cases, we've had pre-positioning of the response teams. We've had pretty large scale, especially in these states where we expect floods every year, effort to raise awareness of people, vulnerable people, about what they need to do before, during, and after floods, through multiple mediums, not just social media, through newspapers, through radio, through TV. We also have a program of Apda Mitra, which is disaster volunteers in 25 most flood-prone districts. So there is much greater focus on preparedness. Of course, preparedness is not very visible. Preparedness effects are, if you don't get any credit for a disaster that did happen. So there are no counterfactuals which are visual. So there is much greater emphasis on preparedness than on response. I think we have to do a much better job of recovery. I think we don't have a predictable system of recovery. We launch large-scale recovery programs after major disasters, but for small, medium-scale disasters, there has to be a predictability to how we assist communities, how we uh, understand what their needs are, how they want to recover, and have a system of supporting recovery. I think on that, I think we have work to do. So the next question is from Richard, which says, "Can you give example where social networks have been leveraged both ways, proactive for at-risk areas and recovery if the disaster occurs?" I think this is somewhat related to the question that you asked earlier also, uh, of communities developing and leveraging social networks to support disaster preparedness and recovery. But now you're asking a slightly different question of both proactive for at-risk areas and recovery if the disaster occurs. I think the example here is of Odisha after in the run-up to cyclone Phylline in 2013, where the work that was done with communities to organize themselves and have a systematic approach to preparedness to deal with the cyclones. So I think that was a big asset, that the community level organization, and that assisted in recovery after the cyclone Phylline as well. Another example of that is, if you recall, 2004 tsunami in Tamil Nadu. There was one village which was highlighted. I was talking about leveraging social networks. Example of a village in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, called Samiyarpettai, which had done some community level work in the months preceding the tsunami to deal with cyclones and storm surges that accompanied. As a result, when the tsunami, cyclone and storm surge, because there was sort of social cohesion around disaster safety. They were able to manage much better than the adjoining villages, and the mortality was lower in Samyar Petai. And because it was they had prepared, so they were able to reduce the risk of mortality, and it also served them well in the follow-up to the tsunami in terms of during the reconstruction and recovery as well. So that's an example. Okay, there is a question from Ganesha D. How to reach people, those who are living in urban areas, periphery, and prepare them as well, as they have least access to facilities and technology. I think this is a very good question. I think in the uh, peri-urban areas, the infrastructure, the communication, the level of organization is not always uh, you know up to mark. How are heritage sites taken care of? How are they affected by earthquakes, and how they are taken care of? I think it's a very good question, and there is a lot of work that has been done on this issue. As you have probably followed in Nepal, after the earthquake in Nepal, there was a big loss to heritage sites and museums. And it is basically for each heritage site, there has to be a plan to deal with the consequences of an earthquake. It is a very detailed. This would require a very detailed reply, but I will just uh, divide it in three parts. The first part is that in some cases it may be possible and financially feasible to systematically assess the risk, the structural risk to the heritage precincts, and undertake retrofitting actions in a sensitive way, so that you not only protect the building or site from the damages of earthquake, but also maintain its historical character. There are two examples in this regard which I can encourage you to look at. One is to look at Patan Museum in Kathmandu, which is an excellent example of how to retrofit a masonry building, a historic building, in a very sensitive way, so that you make it earthquake resistant while also maintaining its character. The second one is the retrofitting of the palace in Tripura, in Agartala, which is also an example of how to do this. So there is this whole possibility of retrofitting these structures to make them better withstand the effects of earthquakes. So that's one. The second is that in many cases it may be very difficult or very expensive, or it may be difficult to find the right kind of expertise to actually make a historical structure earthquake resistant. In such a situation, what we need is to have some sort of prioritization. Have an inventory of what is there in the heritage precinct. How do we? What is the special plan for protecting objects which are especially valuable? Having an inventory of all of that, so that when an earthquake occurs, we know what is where, and there is a systematic plan for extricating in a sensitive fashion the stuff that is buried there, and to the extent possible rebuilding it. An essential element of that is also sensitization of relief workers who work in the earthquake affected areas after any earthquake. There have been instances where the debris from a heritage site has been dealt with as if it is just any debris, and that is clearly not something that is clearly not the right thing to do, because it is uh, it is
it is precious. It's not just any debris, and there may be precious objects or sometimes even building materials which may be no longer available and which may be required for rebuilding. So the point I'm making is that there is one aspect of that is to also prepare emergency responders to deal with heritage sites that have been damaged in a very sensitive way. So there is a whole body of work that is going on in this area. There is a course that ICROM runs on first aid of cultural heritage sites that we need to look into. Then we have a question from Muzakkir. How can old cities like Shahjahanabad be prepared? I think to some extent, my earlier question, earlier answer in response to Meenakshi on heritage sites answered that. But there are other sort of non-heritage aspects of Shahjahanabad-like situation which we need to talk about. The first thing that I will say is that because of the high level of density and old buildings, the risk is extremely high. And we have to sort of systematically reduce that risk, starting with what we can do right away and what will take a long time and resources to do. A lot of the injuries and deaths in earthquakes occur after when people get affected by falling hazards, not necessarily only by the collapse of buildings. So at least in high density situations, where you have flower pots on balconies, where you have loose wires, which have the possibility of toppling over, at least those should be fastened, and we should try to sort of see that they do not become falling hazards. Then secondly, over the long term, I think there is no other way but to have some sort of conservative surgery of these areas so that we can decongest them and at least make possible for the emergency responders to access these areas. This is a very tough task. There are not many examples where it has been done successfully on a large scale. And the third is really within that vulnerable situation, having simple do's and don'ts for people to sort of minimize the risk of losses, particularly the loss of lives and injury. So it's a very difficult situation to sort of prepare for earthquakes, especially in highly dense old cities such as Shahjahanabad. But there are actions that can be taken to begin to reduce risk, begin to reduce the risk of fires that emanate after earthquakes, simply because the wiring is poor or there are loose wires hanging. So I think those things which can be done without incurring too much cost can be done immediately. And then, of course, over the long term, more sophisticated, complex and expensive options have to be pursued. Then we have a question from, are the major issues faced in the recent floods? What are the major issues faced in the recent floods in India, especially when it is widespread in 7 at the same time? I think right now, I don't know how to say what the major issues are. The major issue is that we have improved a huge deal in better forecasting and early warning of the weather, which then feeds into how we forecast the stream flows in our cities. But what is important is that how do we take that forward and come up with very specific, location-specific inundation forecasts. So, for example, if we say that a certain river is flowing 10 centimeters above danger level, and it is projected to go up even further, we ought to be able to say that this means that this village or this town is likely to be inundated, and for how long. So in other words, I think the big challenge is to make our forecast in early morning really location specific, and also have a differentiated approach for urban and rural areas. In urban areas, the lead time between the flood forecasting is relatively low. A lot of localized, built local built environment intervenes and determines the characteristics of the flood. So I think so how do we have a differentiated strategy for urban and rural areas? I think that's another challenge that we have to face. Then the next question is Sushma Suresh Babu, in a city like Mumbai that is riddled by slums, how can structural changes be made in order to improve disaster preparedness across social classes? I don't know what you specifically mean by structural changes. Whether you mean when you mean structural changes, you're talking about physical structures or you're talking about social structures. I can talk a little bit about the physical structural dimension of it. I think irrespective of the different kinds of densities we have in a city like Mumbai, um, which leads to high risk, including risk of flooding. We can do some preventive things before the onset of, say, an urban flood season, and these basic things include stuff like a clearing of drains, uh, desilting of drains, better public awareness to sort of not encroach on stormwater drains, uh, better documentation of where flooding has occurred in the past, linking that with rainfall patterns and coming up with at least a simple method of establishing thresholds as to how much rain causes flooding where. So I think with a range of these things, we should be able to deal with disaster risk, particularly urban flood risk in areas like Mumbai. There is a question from Pia which says, in dense urban areas, how do you define what building back better is when opinion and vested interests differ? I think this is a great question, and it is not a question which is very easy to answer. That's why, in the earlier part of our conversation, I said that when we approach recovery, build back better, it has to be done not in a top-down way, but there has to be a process of consultation, a process of engagement with citizens, so that everyone's voice is heard and we can negotiate and come up with a coherent vision of what what we want in terms of recovery. So there is no clear-cut answer. It's the only thing I can say is that it requires direct citizens engagement, a process where everybody has a voice, everybody comes around the table to negotiate a vision for what recovery should be. So I think that's the answer I can give for now. The next question we have is uh, from Mokshika. I think it is a repeat. What are the major issues faced in the recent floods? We've already talked about the 7 states. Then we have, can you have a site-specific software or mathematical models which are commonly used for disaster management? Uh, well, I don't know what you mean by site-specific models, etc. But of course, let's take the example of urban floods. There are urban flood models which basically um, there are urban flood models which can tell you kind of rainfall, this kind of stream flow from upstream what is the kind of inundation you can expect. And these models have to be tweaked for different sites. They have to be site specific. They can't be general. Likewise, for earthquakes, we can develop models which talk about this is the kind of building stock we have. This is the kind of these are the kind of soil conditions we are sitting in. This is the kind of probable seismic hazard, and based on these three, this is the kind of damage we can expect. And for this kind of damage, this is the kind of mortality we can expect, and the level of injuries we can expect. If you go to USGS pager website, whenever there's a significant earthquake anywhere in the world, within half an hour or 40 minutes, they come up with a probabilistic estimate of what to expect in terms of mortality as well as economic loss. Of course, the initial set is, just an initial estimate, and they revise it as they get more information from the site of the disaster. So yes, indeed, it is possible to develop site-specific models for anticipating the impacts of disasters. I think we have come to an end. I don't see any more questions coming from the moderator. With that, I thank you for your patience while we were having this chat. For a good 10-15 minutes, the connection didn't work properly, but I hope we still had a meaningful, productive dialogue this evening. Thank you.